Hello and welcome to the Occult Book Review. I'm here at Bowleycarrageen Stone Circle in County Wicklow this morning. I tried to get the solstice sunrise, but unfortunately, as you can see, it's a little bit too misty. Anyway, the reason I'm here is to review Morgan Daimler's new book, Fairies, A Guide to the Celtic Fairfolk. It's funny that this book should come out at the same time as Magical Folk, British and Irish fairies from, I think it's from 500 AD to the present day. That's edited by Simon Young and Dr. Kerry Holbrook, and it includes a lot of essays from contemporary folklorists and academics. Daimler's book then is, on the surface you may not think it fits into the Occult Book Review, but it really does. Daimler says later on in the book that the book has been her attempt to draw attention to the older traditional beliefs regarding fairy, the other folk. And it's funny, the very first Occult Book Review was The Eighth Tower by John Keel, who speaks about getting in touch with spiritual dimensions. Daimler does draw a distinction, I should say, between fairy and other astral dimensions. I'll talk about that in a while. But the afterword to Daimler's book is very similar to the afterword to John Keel's book, and that's because that's the reason why this book is so distinctive. She talks about the dangers inherent in trying to contact fairies, I suppose, and for especially today when you have that kind of whole new age almost eco-warrior type fairy, which is not really the way fairies are in culture, going back to even to Sumeria, although this book does focus on the European Celtic traditions. So Daimler's book then is a mixture really of academia, folk traditions, personal interpretation, and she goes back to cunning folk, to witches' familiars, and the reason for this is because she doesn't separate her own practice, and I think that makes the book quite unique in that you are getting a very contemporary interpretation and first-hand honest expression of what fairies are. And it's different then to a lot of books, because sometimes you can get kind of people looking at fairies with a lot of whimsy and tweeness, and they don't take them seriously. But that's why I want to include this book in the Occult Book Review, because when you get down to it and you understand and you get to read about the experiences people have had with the other folk, with the other crowd, with fairies, you begin to realise and you begin to kind of discover very quickly that it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and there's very often a price to pay. Now, I do accept that there is a distinction here for a lot of people. Some people will talk about neurosis and self-created psychological conditions simply because they're putting themselves in a mindset that makes them susceptible to their thoughts that come around, I suppose, when you're in places like this, when you're doing ritual occult work. But there's also a very tangible effect when people are dealing with fairies, and this is what Daimler tries to convey. She says it quite a lot. That's why I mentioned John Keel. She does actually say, look, if you're going to do this, it's on your head. That's very much like what Keel says at the end of The Eighth Tower. Keel goes a bit further. He says, don't do it at all. Whereas Daimler talks about the wisdom, the personal growth that comes from this type of work. So you get the way the book is broken down in very readable sections. And what I mean by that is you get the usual kind of what people say fairies are. You get the Christian interpretation, the idea that fairies are fallen angels. Then you get the different cultural breakdowns from the Seelie to the unseelie court, for example, which is, as Daimler says, it's very much a Scottish thing. I suppose the contemporary portrayal is the good fairy and the bad fairy, but really it's a lot deeper than that. That's another point that Daimler reiterates again and again. This liminal area, there's no clear distinctions. There's also no clear distinctions between the physicality of fairies or the insubstantiability of fairies. So as I've said, Daimler draws a distinction between fairy and other ethereal dimensions. She talks about how the kind of Christian interpretation of the realm of fairy almost being purgatory kind of comes into play, becomes very popular, I would say. It infiltrates older beliefs in my own interpretation of the way things evolve anyway. She talks about Wence's work, The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. She talks about Briggs' work, and she goes to a lot of medieval texts, which I really liked. And there's kind of a parallel there to the book last week, which I reviewed, Tom Hatz's The Witch's Ointment. She talks about certain spells that turn up, to repel elves. And so that's the initial start of the book. So she wants to talk about what fairies are, what fairies aren't. And she really comes to a conclusion that, nobody really knows, and they tend to change. And if you go to try and define what fairies are, what the other crowd are, you're most likely going to end up in trouble. She then gives a breakdown of all the different types of fairy, and I found this very interesting. I saw an awful lot of parallels to other cultures, which she talks about fairies outside of Europe at the end of the book in a small section. I would love to see her do a book all about fairies in a non-European context at some time. I found some lovely parallels to Aboriginal stories. This book in particular, Wise Women of the Dreamtime, really interesting stories. The indigenous Aboriginal people have oral traditions going back 10,000 years, and yet Daimler talks about the same warding techniques, which is kind of amazing, really. She talks about ash, she talks about iron oxide, and yet going back to an oral tradition 10,000 years, you have the same thing in Australia and New Zealand, warding fairies away. The fairies, of course, are called the Mimi. There's also a changeling, which is very comparable to the changelings that Daimler talks about in a European Celtic context as well. So it makes you wonder, like, where did this begin? And if it really is just a psychological construct in order for us to kind of relate to our environment, then why have these warding techniques? So the occult aspect comes into it there, very much so. Here in Ireland, of course, we've had some very sad cases where children and people have come to a horrible demise simply because they've been associated with fairy. And that's a theme that Daimler tackles in a very sensitive way, I think. The idea of, are fairies evil? Are fairies demons? Are fairies good? Are they something that is so beyond us? Or are they something that kind of, as in some other world cultures, they come here to try and teach us? So again, looking back at last week's book, you see as Christianity begins to take hold, there's this separation, I suppose. Everything that was pagan becomes demonized. Everything that was separate from the church becomes against the church, so not just in a cultural context. Of course, we have the Irish old gods, the Tuatha, who are very much associated with fairy. However, as Daimler talks about, there are instances, even though these early books were written by Christian monks, there are instances of these godlike people appearing in the text with fairy, as if fairies were already here, as if the spirits of the land were already here, and that separates them again from the gods. So it is a kind of a murky world. She talks about the idea of the stature of fairies, all the different denizens, how some are supposed to be tall, some are supposed to be small. In Ireland, some of the fairies are supposed to be small, and when you go to places like Seafin on the top of Wicklow Hill, on top of Seafin Hill in Wicklow, for example, one of the things that really strikes you is the size of the entranceway. I mean, no fully grown adult could get in, but basically when you get in through the roof, which has been excavated, you go down the passageway and there's actually art carved onto the stones, and yet no one can actually fit in. So that's kind of could be the root of some of the ideas that fairies are small, I think. That's just one interpretation again, of course. Some of the beings that Daimler writes about have a tendency to recur in different world mythologies, as I've already said. If anyone has been reading Christopher Noel's recent series on the Siren, you'll see great parallels there to some of the fairy beings in this kind of Celtic interpretation of the mythology, usually to the kind of detriment of the poet or the songwriter or the artist, who initially gets some great inspiration from this type of figure. She talks about the Aishi. There are different interpretations of these types of fairies, the gentry and so on. There are lots of parallels to the work of Jacques Vallée. Of course, Jacques Vallée talks about these kinds of beings in a more contemporary context, but what we see are some of the same themes recurring. You know, someone being brought to help give birth, for example. I spoke about the Whitley Strieber and Dr. Jeff Kripal book, The Supernatural, where the same thing happens. You have this association between sexuality and fairies. And Daimler asks some very interesting questions about why that might be. And she also talks about this idea of needing the physicality of a human being for certain events. For example, in Irish mythology, she talks about, sorry, not Irish mythology, Irish folklore. She talks about certain stories where people stumble upon fairies playing a game or are about to have a dance, but it can't take place until the human being interacts with fairy. Now, that's very interesting in terms of some occult practices, especially the idea of the observer effect, where something has to be observed before it can become tangible. Now, that's just something that I began to think about as I was reading what Daimler was saying. But I suppose there's room for me to be wrong there, but I thought it was very interesting, that kind of quantum effect. Of course, the language throughout ancient history up until today would have been a lot different until people knew about quantum physics. So perhaps that's why you have these kind of allegories as opposed to the actual underlying process, which is to be observed in order to manifest fully. Another chapter talks about when is the best time to try and make a contact, whether it's in some kind of ritualistic context or whether it's maybe a time to avoid so you don't actually stumble upon these forces. She talks about kind of dawn. Might be in a bit of trouble there. It talks about dusk. She talks about certain times of the year, the solstices, the equinoxes. And I thought it was interesting, which she talks about in certain cultures, there are days that are safe and there are days that are dangerous. And she says that one of the days that are dangerous is a Wednesday, which, if anyone knows John Keel's work, which I've been speaking about as well, Wednesday was one of the days that he thought was some kind of window or portal into extra dimensional kind of realms. So that's interesting. I wonder if there is a parallel there. She talks about the idea of sometimes people going to fairy and still being here physically, that kind of possession. And she talks about the kind of remedies, as I've mentioned already, the idea of warding, protection, the evolution of these, the Banfasa, the wise woman who has a fairy familiar. Sometimes it ends kind of in a destructive way for the person, and again, a lot of kind of fairy lore will say that you can't get too close lest you kind of become either insubstantial yourself or you're whisked away to fairy. She talks about the idea of a very important theme, of course, is fairies and the dead. In a lot of stories that Daimler writes about, and indeed in other cultural contexts, fairies are kind of, they can be the ghosts of people who have died, but it's not always the case. Not everyone who dies goes to fairy, and not every fairy, of course, is someone who lived here on Earth. So, but one of the points that Daimler keeps coming back to is, look, it's very hard to define this. I think it was, I'm not sure if it was after Wentz's work, but there was kind of a movement in Ireland to try and separate the authentic folklore from the folklore that was being created by people in towns when they wanted to tell the scholars or the academics what they thought they wanted to hear. So you'd get kind of this folklore being created on the spot. So it was very hard to differentiate. I suppose nearby here is Rathgal, and it has a lot of very old, authentic stories about fertility and so on. But it also has some very new stories that the local lads in the pub would tell the researchers, and when people went to look at the stories, they realised that these stories weren't authentic at all. They weren't coming from any kind of long tradition. In fact, they were just lads looking to get an extra pint. So the book really does cover a lot of ground. Daimler also talks about the idea of fairy roads, fairy paths. I'd recommend Paul Devereux's book, Spirit Roads, if anyone wants to go a bit deeper into that. There's a lot of Irish folklore, and one of the researchers on this book is Eddie Linehan, who if anyone is interested in fairies, they'll know who he is anyway. She talks about fairies in America as well, and I thought there was a couple of books that I read a few years ago about American fairies in a fictional context, of course. The Woodwife by Terry Windling and Patricia McKillop's Something Rich and Strange, both illustrated by Brian Fround, who's kind of well known for being an artist associated with fairy. So those books are very good for people who want to talk about, who want to read about the mythology that's coming about in America at the moment. I suppose the best fictional Irish book about fairies has to be King of Morning, Queen of Day by Ian MacDonald. Someone else might disagree with me on that, but I've yet to kind of read a better book which incorporates all of the emerging motifs and contemporary academia as well as ancient scholarship as well. One other thing I wanted to mention, the idea of Daimler talks about fairies being associated with certain places, and this is part of her section on the different denizens and beings of fairy. And she talks about land spirits being associated with like rocks, water, and the separation of those types of beings to other types of fairy. And I suppose I think to myself, well, it depends on how deep your animism goes, really, as to whether or not you think a spiritual being will be stuck in a certain place, if you know what I mean. I wrote about that for The Wild Hunt. I'll put a link in the comment section if anyone wants to read about what I think about that. So overall then, I think Fairies by Morgan Daimler is a really important book. I think it's a book that you'll be able to go back to because of the way it's laid out. It's laid out, there's a lot more to it than I've spoken about here. Obviously I can't go through the whole book, but I suppose for future editions I think it would be a great idea to have an index, just so you could go back and kind of reference all the times that a certain type of being occurs. There are notes at the end of each chapter, of course, though. At the end of the book then, of course, Daimler, as she states at the start, she has her own particular way of interacting with fairy and witchcraft, and she gives her own personal examples of her own interactions. And again, there's lots of warnings there as well. So Fairies by Morgan Daimler, published by Moon Books. I highly recommend this. I think it's a book that people will look to in order to use as a reference, as well as being able to pick up and read through. It's very accessible, but it also has quite a bit of depth to it too. So I'll see you again next week, hopefully, if I make it out of here, for another Occult book review. Thanks, bye.